The Parker family home had always been a sanctuary, nestled in a quiet corner of the town. The old Victorian house was more than just a building. It was a living scrapbook filled with memories of birthdays, holidays, and lazy Sunday afternoons. The house's creaky floorboards and drafty windows were just part of its charm, quirks they'd long since grown accustomed to. But as autumn crept in, bringing with it a chill that seemed to seep into the very walls, the house began to feel different. The air inside grew heavy, almost oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. It started with the smallest of things. Helen Parker, the matriarch, was the first to notice. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the master bedroom, she heard a door creak open. Thinking it was the wind, she paid it no mind until it happened again. The door to the bedroom closet, which she was certain she had closed, stood slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness peered back at her from inside the closet, and a shiver ran down her spine. Later that evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Helen mentioned the incident to her husband, David. A man of science and reason, David dismissed her concerns with a chuckle, chalking it up to the house settling or perhaps an overlooked detail. "You've just been stressed," he said, his tone light. "It's been a long week. The house is old, it creaks, nothing to worry about." Helen nodded, forcing a smile, but the unease lingered. She was not a woman prone to flights of fancy, and there was something about that door that had felt wrong, something she couldn't quite put into words. As the days passed, the small disturbances continued. Objects seemed to move from their usual places. Keys left on the kitchen counter would turn up in the living room, or a book on the nightstand would be found on the floor in the morning. The dog, Max, began to behave oddly as well, growling at empty spaces and refusing to enter certain rooms. Helen wasn't the only one noticing the changes. Their teenage daughter, Emily, mentioned feeling like she was being watched, her normally vibrant energy dampened by a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. At first, she kept it to herself, not wanting to add to her mother's worries. But one night, as she was getting ready for bed, she caught a glimpse of movement in the hallway mirror. Just a flash, gone as quickly as it came, but enough to make her heart race. When she told her parents, Helen's unease deepened, while David remained unconvinced. But the final straw came when even David could no longer deny that something was amiss. One evening, after a long day at work, he settled into his study to catch up on some paperwork. The room, once his refuge, felt strangely cold, the air heavy with a quiet tension. As he worked, the door to the study creaked open. David looked up, expecting to see Helen or Emily, but the hallway beyond was empty. He got up, closed the door, and returned to his desk, only to have it creak open again. This time with a slow, deliberate sound that sent a chill down his spine. David stared at the open doorway, a creeping sense of dread replacing his earlier dismissiveness. The logical part of his mind struggled to find an explanation. Faulty hinges, a draft, something he could fix. But the way the door had opened, so deliberate and slow, felt almost intentional. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the unease clung to him like a shadow. That night, after the family had gone to bed, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. Every creak, every gust of wind against the windows seemed louder, more pronounced. He turned over, watching the bedroom door as if expecting it to open by itself. Hours passed and sleep eluded him, the silence of the house heavy and suffocating. In the morning, with dark circles under his eyes, David admitted to Helen that he was starting to feel the same unease she had described. Something was wrong with the house. something that logic and reason couldn't easily explain. Helen suggested they bring in someone to investigate, perhaps a priest or a psychic. But David shook his head. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Let's start with something simpler. I'll set up some cameras just to see if we can catch whatever it is." Helen agreed, though her mind was already spinning with worst-case scenarios. As she moved through the house that day, every shadow seemed deeper, every noise sharper. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something or someone was watching them. And as night fell once more, the house, their home, seemed to settle into a silence so deep it was almost a warning. The cameras were installed by the weekend, small and unobtrusive, placed in the corners of the rooms where the disturbances had been most frequent. David spent hours meticulously setting up the system, testing each camera, making sure the angles were just right. The technology provided him with a sense of control, a way to impose order on the growing chaos that was slowly creeping into their lives. That first night, as the family went about their routine, the cameras quietly observed, capturing every flicker of light, every movement. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, the usual creaks and groans subdued, as if whatever was within it knew it was being watched. But in the darkness, in the quiet hours when the Parker family slept, the true nature of their unseen guest would begin to reveal itself, setting the stage for a discovery far more terrifying than any ghost story they could have imagined. The Parker family's once peaceful home had become a place of dread. The cameras were installed, their small red lights blinking ominously in the corners of each room. David, always the skeptic, had convinced himself that the footage would reveal nothing more than harmless coincidences. Perhaps a draft here, a settling foundation there. But as the days passed and the disturbances grew more intense, even he began to question the rational explanations he had clung to so tightly. The first few nights of recordings showed nothing out of the ordinary. The family reviewed the footage together, huddled around David's laptop in the dim light of the study. Hours of footage sped by in fast forward, a time-lapse of their home's empty rooms, shadows lengthening as the night wore on. But nothing more. The unease remained, but with no evidence to support their fears, David was ready to call it all a strange psychological phenomenon. But then came the night when everything changed. It was late, well past midnight, when Helen was jolted awake by the sound of something crashing downstairs. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, listening intently. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, the remnants of a bad dream clinging to her consciousness. But then she heard it again, a low thud, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "David," she whispered, shaking him awake. "David, there's something downstairs." David groaned, disoriented, but the urgency in Helen's voice brought him to full alert. They both sat in the dark, listening to the unsettling sounds coming from below. The noise continued, growing louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the sound of a house settling. It was the sound of something, or someone, moving through their home. Grabbing the nearest object that could serve as a weapon, a heavy flashlight, David led the way downstairs, with Helen close behind. Each step felt like an eternity, the old wooden stairs creaking under their weight. When they reached the bottom, the house was plunged into an eerie silence once more. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. David scanned the room, his heart racing. Everything seemed in place, yet something was profoundly wrong. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. They moved cautiously, checking each room, but found nothing out of place. Reluctantly, they returned to bed, though neither of them slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, David immediately went to review the footage. Helen and Emily joined him, their anxiety palpable as they crowded around the laptop. The video played, showing the house's empty rooms in the dead of night. For a long while, nothing happened, and David was beginning to think it had all been a figment of their collective imagination. But then, at 2:47 a.m., something flickered on the screen. In the dim hallway outside the living room, a shadow moved, just a blur at first, then more defined as it passed in front of one of the cameras. The figure was unmistakable, tall, shrouded in an old, tattered cloak that seemed to absorb the light, leaving nothing but darkness where its face should have been. Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as they watched the figure move silently through the house. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, as if it knew exactly where the cameras were positioned. It never revealed its face, always staying just out of the camera's full view. The figure paused in front of the door to the attic, its head tilting as though listening for something. And then, in one fluid motion, it opened the attic door and disappeared inside, the door closing behind it with a soft click. The video ended, leaving the Parker family in stunned silence. Emily was the first to speak, her voice trembling. What? What was that? Who is that? David replayed the footage, his mind racing. He wanted to find a logical explanation, but none came. There was no denying what they had seen. Someone or something was living in their house, sneaking around at night while they slept. Helen's mind was reeling, torn between fear and disbelief. It can't be real, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. How could someone be living in our house without us knowing? David, too, struggled to process what they had just witnessed. The footage was clear. This wasn't some figment of their imagination. But the figure was more than just a trespasser. There was something deeply unsettling about the way it moved, the way it seemed to know its way around the house as if it had been there for a long time. Emily's eyes were wide with fear, and for the first time, David saw something in his daughter's face that he had never seen before. Pure terror. She had always been brave, always the first to dismiss ghost stories and horror movies as silly fantasies. But this was different. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's mind was already racing through the possibilities. Calling the police seemed like the obvious choice, but something stopped him. The figure in the video, whoever or whatever it was, hadn't done anything overtly threatening. They had simply moved through the house, gone into the attic, and vanished. What could the police do with that? And more importantly, how could they explain it? "We need to check the attic," David said finally, his voice grim. "We need to find out who, or what, is up there." Helen looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. They had to know. They couldn't live with this shadow hanging over them, couldn't sleep at night knowing that someone, or something, was sharing their home. With daylight offering a fragile sense of security, David led the way to the attic door, flashlight in hand. The stairs creaked under their weight as they ascended, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. When they reached the top, David hesitated for a moment before turning the handle. The door swung open, revealing the dark, dusty space beyond. The attic was as they had left it, cluttered with old furniture, forgotten boxes, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. But as they moved deeper into the room, something caught their eye. In the far corner, behind a stack of old boxes, was a small makeshift bed. The blankets were worn and threadbare, and the mattress was little more than a pile of rags. Nearby, they found a few more disturbing items. A set of clothes, old and tattered like the cloak, folded neatly on a chair. A small pile of half-eaten food, and a notebook, the pages filled with strange, unintelligible scrawls. But it was the smell that hit them hardest, a musty, decaying odor that seemed to permeate the air, making it hard to breathe. Helen felt a wave of nausea as she realized the truth. Someone had been living here, right above their heads, for who knows how long. But who was it? And why had they stayed hidden all this time? As David moved to examine the notebook, a noise from behind them made them all freeze. It was a soft, almost imperceptible creak, the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. They turned slowly, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the attic. And then they saw it, standing in the doorway, watching them with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. The figure. David's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure, now standing just a few feet away. Up close, it was even more terrifying. The cloak was dirty and frayed, and the figure's face was obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the presence, the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to radiate from it. For a moment, no one moved. The figure just stood there, watching them, as if waiting for something. Then, with a low, raspy breath, it turned and disappeared down the stairs, leaving the family standing in the attic, too stunned to move. When they finally gathered the courage to follow, the figure was gone. The house was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. But the fear that had taken hold of the Parker family's hearts was not so easily dispelled. They knew now that they were not alone in their home, and whatever was living with them was far more than just an unseen guest. It was something darker, something that had been waiting, watching, biding its time, and now the haunting had truly begun. The discovery in the attic left the Parker family shaken to their core. The image of that cloaked figure standing silently in the doorway haunted their every waking moment. They had uncovered the undeniable proof that someone was living with them right under their noses, yet they were no closer to understanding who or what this presence was. The air in the house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt thick with dread and uncertainty. Days passed in a tense, fearful haze. No one spoke much, each member of the family lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. David tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, throwing himself into work and the usual household chores. But even he couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to envelop their once cozy home. Helen, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves. She jumped at every sound, every unexpected movement, her imagination running wild with dark possibilities. Emily, usually the most spirited of them all, had become quiet and withdrawn, her once vibrant energy drained away by the terror that now lived in every shadow of the house. They knew they couldn't avoid the attic forever. The thought of confronting whatever, or whoever, was up there filled them with dread. But the alternative was even worse. They couldn't continue living in fear, couldn't let this unseen guest control their lives. They had to take action to reclaim their home from the darkness that had taken root. Finally, after days of mounting tension, they decided to return to the attic. This time, they were better prepared. David armed himself with a baseball bat, while Helen clutched a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Emily, though terrified, insisted on coming along, holding a flashlight in trembling hands. They moved as a unit, their fear palpable but their resolve firm. The house was eerily silent as they ascended the narrow staircase to the attic. Each step seemed to echo through the empty halls, amplifying the tension that had settled over them like a suffocating blanket. When they reached the attic door, David hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He could feel Helen and Emily's eyes on him, their fear a mirror of his own. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The attic was just as they had left it, dark, cluttered, and filled with the musty smell of decay. The small makeshift bed was still there, as were the ragged clothes and the strange, unintelligible scrawls in the notebook. But now, in the harsh light of day, the room seemed even more disturbing, the signs of habitation impossible to ignore. They began to search the attic more thoroughly this time, determined to find any clues that might explain who their mysterious intruder was. As they sifted through the clutter, Helen noticed something odd about one of the walls. The wood panels looked newer than the rest of the attic, the seams just slightly off from the surrounding boards. "David," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this." David moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he examined the wall. There was something off about it, something that didn't belong. He ran his fingers along the edge of the panels, feeling for any sign of a hidden latch or seam. After a few tense moments, his fingers caught on a small, almost imperceptible gap. With a gentle push, the panel slid open, revealing a dark, narrow space beyond. Helen gasped, stepping back in shock. Emily's grip on the flashlight tightened, the beam of light shaking as she pointed it into the hidden space. The small, dark room beyond the wall was cramped and filthy, the air stale and oppressive. But what caught their attention most was the figure huddled in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. At first, they thought it was a pile of old clothes, discarded and forgotten. But as David stepped closer, the figure stirred, emitting a low, guttural sound that sent a jolt of terror through the family. The figure shifted, slowly turning towards the light, and they all gasped in unison. The figure was human, or at least it had been once. The face that stared back at them was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over sharp bones, the eyes hollow and vacant. The tattered cloak that had concealed the figure's identity before now hung limply from its frail shoulders. But it was the face itself that made Helen's blood run cold. It was a face she knew, a face she had loved and mourned. "Thomas?" Helen's voice was barely audible, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. "Oh my God! Thomas!" David stood frozen in shock, his mind racing to make sense of the impossible. Thomas, their son who had gone missing years ago, presumed dead after that terrible accident, was sitting in front of them, alive but horribly changed. His once bright eyes were now dull, his features gaunt and ghostly, his hair matted and unkempt. There was no recognition in his eyes, no sign that he knew who they were. "Thomas!" Helen cried, rushing forward, but David grabbed her arm, holding her back. The figure that had once been their son recoiled at the sound of his name, a low growl escaping his lips as he curled into himself, as if trying to hide from them. Emily stared in horror, her mind rejecting what her eyes were telling her. This couldn't be her brother. Thomas had been full of life, always laughing, always ready with a joke or a smile. The person in front of her was a shadow, a twisted, broken version of the boy she remembered. "Thomas, it's us," David said, his voice trembling with emotion. "It's your family. We've been looking for you. We never stopped looking." But there was no response, no flicker of recognition in Thomas's eyes. He simply stared at them, his expression vacant, as if he were seeing them for the first time. The only sound in the room was his ragged breathing, each breath a painful reminder of the years that had passed since they last saw him. Helen's heart broke as she looked at her son, her mind flashing back to the day he had disappeared. They had searched everywhere, clung to hope, even when all hope seemed lost, but eventually they had been forced to accept the worst, that Thomas was gone forever. But now, here he was, alive but lost to them in a different way, his mind shattered, his identity fractured beyond recognition. "What happened to you?" Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Where have you been?" But Thomas remained silent, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and with it came the unbearable weight of grief and fear. Their son was alive, but he was not the Thomas they had known. He was a stranger, a ghost of the boy they had loved. David, ever the practical one, tried to think of what to do next. "We need to get him help," he said, though his voice wavered. "A doctor. Someone who can help him remember." But as he spoke, a deep sense of dread settled over the family. What if Thomas never remembered? What if the person he had been was gone forever, replaced by this broken shell of a human being? The questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. The discovery of Thomas had answered one mystery, but opened the door to another, far more terrifying one. Who had Thomas become during those years of disappearance? How had he survived? And more importantly, what kind of darkness had he brought back with him into their home? As they stood in that hidden space, the cold reality of their situation began to set in. They had found their son, but they had also uncovered something far more frightening, a reminder that the worst horrors are not always found in the unknown, but in the familiar, twisted into something unrecognizable. Thomas's vacant eyes met theirs once more, and in that moment they realized the full extent of their terrifying discovery. The person standing before them was not the son they had lost, but someone, or something, else entirely. And as they slowly backed out of the hidden room, their hearts heavy with a mixture of fear and sorrow, they knew that their lives would never be the same again. The shadows that had haunted their home were no longer unseen. They had a face, a name, and the true horror had only just begun. The days following the discovery of Thomas passed in a blur of confusion and despair. The Parker family, once so close, now seemed to drift apart, each member grappling with the horrific reality of what they had uncovered. The house that had once been their refuge now felt like a prison, its walls closing in around them as they faced the impossible choice that lay before them. Thomas was back, but he was a shadow of the boy they had loved. He moved through the house like a ghost, silent and detached, his eyes vacant and unseeing. He ate little, spoke less, and when he did, his words were garbled, barely coherent. Helen's heart broke every time she looked at him, torn between the desperate need to hold him close and the overwhelming fear of what he had become. David, ever the rational one, tried to approach the situation logically. He reached out to doctors, specialists, anyone who might be able to explain Thomas's condition or offer some hope of recovery. But each visit ended the same way, with furrowed brows and sympathetic looks. No one could understand what had happened to Thomas, let alone how to bring him back to the person he once was. Emily, who had always looked up to her older brother, now avoided him as much as possible. The fear that had taken root in her heart grew with each passing day. The brother she had idolized, now a source of terror. She couldn't reconcile the image of the vibrant, playful boy she had known with the hollow figure that now wandered their home. She felt a gnawing guilt for the relief she felt when she managed to avoid him. But the fear was too strong to ignore. The family was at a breaking point, the weight of their situation pressing down on them with unbearable force. They had found Thomas, but in doing so, they had lost something else. Their sense of safety, their unity, their hope. And now they faced an impossible decision. Should they try to reintegrate this lost, broken relative into their lives, or should they let him remain in the shadows, a ghost of the past? Helen couldn't bear the thought of abandoning Thomas again. She had spent years mourning him, imagining every possible scenario of his fate, and now that he was here, physically present, the idea of turning him away felt like a betrayal. But every time she looked into his vacant eyes, she felt a deep, primal fear. A fear that this wasn't really her son, but something far darker that had taken his place. David, too, was torn. He wanted to believe that Thomas could recover, that with time and care, he might regain his memories, his personality, his humanity. But the logical part of his mind whispered doubts, dark thoughts that he tried to push away but couldn't entirely silence. What if Thomas never came back? What if he remained a stranger, forever trapped in the limbo of his shattered mind? Could they live with that? Could they subject themselves and Emily to that kind of life? Emily's fear only grew with each passing day. She avoided Thomas as much as possible, staying in her room with the door locked, the weight of her fear pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. She had tried to talk to her parents, to express her terror, but they were too wrapped up in their own struggles to truly listen. She felt alone, abandoned, her once vibrant home now a place of nightmares. The house itself seemed to reflect the family's turmoil. The warmth that had once filled it was gone, replaced by a cold, oppressive silence. Shadows lurked in every corner, and the creaks and groans of the old house seemed to have taken on a new, sinister meaning. The walls, once covered in photos and memories, now felt like barriers, separating each family member in their own personal hell. The final breaking point came one night in the dead of winter. The family sat in the living room, the silence between them thick and heavy. Thomas was there too, sitting in the corner, his presence an ever-present reminder of the choice they had to make. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, its warmth doing little to dispel the cold that had seeped into their bones. Helen couldn't stand it any longer. She stood up, her hands trembling, her voice breaking as she spoke. "We can't go on like this," she said, her eyes darting between David and Emily. "We have to decide what to do. We have to make a choice." David looked at her, his face lined with exhaustion and sorrow. "What choice do we have, Helen? We can't just leave him like this. He's our son." "But is he?" Emily's voice was a whisper, but it cut through the room like a knife. "Is he really our Thomas? Or is he just something that looks like him?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, the weight of it pressing down on them all. Helen's heart ached at the thought, but deep down, she knew that Emily was right. The person sitting in the corner of the room, staring blankly into the fire, was not the Thomas they had known. He was someone else, something else, and the thought terrified her more than she could admit. David's voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "We don't know what happened to him, but we can't just give up. We have to try. We have to do everything we can to help him." "And what if we can't?" Emily's voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes. "What if he never gets better? What if he stays like this forever? Are we supposed to live like this with a stranger in our home? With something that's not really him?" The room fell into a heavy silence once more, the only sound the weak crackling of the fire. Helen's tears flowed freely now, her heart breaking for her daughter, for her husband, for herself. She wanted to believe that they could save Thomas, that they could bring him back to them, but the fear gnawed at her, the doubt growing stronger with each passing day. David wrapped his arms around Helen, pulling her close as they both wept. Emily watched them, her own tears falling silently, the enormity of their situation pressing down on her like a crushing weight. The family was falling apart, the choice they faced tearing them apart from the inside out. In the corner, Thomas remained silent, his eyes fixed on the flames. There was no recognition in his gaze, no sign that he understood the conversation happening around him. He was a shell, an empty vessel, and the sight of him filled Helen with a grief so profound it threatened to consume her. Finally, Helen pulled away from David, wiping her tears with trembling hands. She looked at her daughter, at her husband, and then at the figure in the corner that had once been her son. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was filled with a quiet, resigned determination. "We have to let him go," she said, the words nearly breaking her as she spoke them. We have to accept that he's not our Thomas anymore. He's gone. And if we try to hold on to him, we'll lose ourselves in the process." David's heart shattered at her words, but he knew deep down that she was right. The person they had found in the attic was not their son. Not really. And by trying to force him back into their lives, they were destroying themselves and each other. Emily let out a choked sob, her body trembling as she buried her face in her hands. She had known this was coming, had felt it deep in her bones, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it all too real, all too final. The decision was made, but the pain of it would linger long after the choice was enacted. They would find a place for Thomas, somewhere safe, where he could be cared for, where he could live out the rest of his days in peace. But they would have to let him go, to release the ghost of their son from the prison of their love. As they sat together in the dimly lit room, holding on to each other for support, they knew that this was the hardest thing they would ever have to do. The house, their home, had become a place of nightmares, and they could no longer pretend that everything would be okay. The choice they had made was the only one they could live with, but it left them hollow, broken, and forever changed. In the end, as they prepared to say goodbye to the boy who had once filled their lives with so much joy, they realized that the true horror was not in the presence that had haunted their home, but in the loss of the person they had once known. The darkness that had taken hold of their lives would not be easily dispelled, but they would face it together as a family, broken but still standing. And as the fire flickered weakly in the hearth, the shadows in the room seemed to draw closer, the house settling into a silence so deep it felt like an ending. The Parker family had made their choice, but the pain of it would linger, haunting them in ways they could never fully escape. The unseen guest that had once lurked in the shadows was gone, but the scars it left behind would remain, a reminder of the darkness that had touched their lives and the love that had ultimately failed to save them. The story ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, haunting whisper, the echo of a choice that would stay with the Parker family for the rest of their lives. A reminder